2024, an election year like no other. From the candidates to the issues, from voter integrity and analysis, we'll discuss debates, trends, patterns, election laws, and more. This is Vote 2024, Path to the Polls.
Was the move to manipulate President Biden's unprecedented departure from the presidential race an attempted intra-party coup? In the words of syndicated columnist Rich Lowry, that's a pejorative but accurate description of the campaign to get Biden to quit the race. How's that for getting your attention for this week's Path to the Polls? Now, no modern president has ever stepped back from an election this late in the race. And the stunning development is creating more upheaval in the 2024 election already rocked by an assassination attempt. It prompts so many questions, the most obvious of which is who is the next Democratic presidential nominee? Biden's endorsement of Kamala Harris gives her a leg up, but it is not necessarily a slam dunk. Joe Manchin won't run for president, but he issues a challenge because he thinks Harris is too far left. And who will Kamala Harris choose to be her running mate? 6 names have popped up. Some bring greater strength to the ticket in luring votes needed to beat Donald Trump. As for Kamala Harris's campaign strategy, it's been summed up this way. Keep in mind her legal background here, prosecutor versus felon. Can you imagine if she and Trump debate how fiery that matchup's going to be? Welcome to Pass to the Polls. I'm Bruce Hamilton, and joining me, political analyst Daniel Cronrath. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Bruce.
Boy, the president stepping back from the presidential election caused a frenzy in the Democratic Party. Get to the main question, who is the next Democratic nominee in a minute. But first, let me get to President Biden's move to step back. The Democratic hierarchy worked behind the scenes to force him out. Many top Dems publicly said he needed to bow out of the race. Was the move to manipulate, I'm going to use that word, President Biden's unprecedented departure from the presidential race an attempted intra-party coup? In the words of syndicated columnist Rich Lowry, that's a pejorative but accurate description, as I said before, of the campaign to get Biden to quit the race. He went on to write, for donors, pundits, and elected Democrats to attempt to undo this choice is frankly undemocratic. It looks even less democratic when it's factored in that a small handful of people, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, James Clyburn, and a couple of others, are the ones who have the true power, perhaps, to force Biden from the race. And a reputable Democratic source, and I have this on good authority, was privy to private conversations between Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden. And that source, given permission to speak candidly on conditions of anonymity, says Biden finally dropped out because he was convinced, perhaps coerced, Daniel, that he couldn't win, saying that Pelosi gave them, the Bidens, 3 weeks of the easy way. It was about to be the hard way, quote, presumably employing the 25th Amendment. Was Pelosi about to force him out?
I think all evidence right now, Bruce, is yes. And this has been widely reported. You know, one of the things, again, that we need to think about is when you approach a member of congressional staff and you ask them if something is true and they don't deny it, where there's smoke, there's fire. And the fact that the timing of this was very, very interesting. You know, it was after the President Trump had the assassination attempt. It was after the RNC, in which Trump introduced his own vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, the senator from Ohio. And then all of a sudden, you see this circling back to saying, you know, and I think a lot of the motivation was twofold here, Bruce. One was the donors, okay? A lot of the money was drying up from the Biden campaign. They watched what we saw 3 weeks ago, what, by the way, seems like 3 months ago now, the terrible debate performance by President Biden where he looked disoriented and he looked like he was in a deep state of cognitive decline, okay? The donor money began to dry up after that performance. The DNC saw it. But then the other thing which has been reported too, and this is really hard to believe, Bruce, in modern politics, is that it had been months since the Biden campaign had done any polls of their own, internal polls in any of the battleground states. Months. When they finally did them and saw figures like President Biden behind by 10 points in Arizona, President Biden with states like New Mexico in play, states like New Hampshire in play, effectively from their own internal polling, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, gone off the playing field, it became very, very abundant to this elite, and I'll use the word, the oligarchs of the Democratic Party, the people who really have the controlling power, okay? it became very apparent to them that President Biden's campaign was not going to go over the finish line. And then everything that you just reported, I've seen from different feeds as well, the exact story of former Speaker Pelosi basically giving President Biden an ultimatum. Okay, you either get out the easy way right now and you do it with your family and you make the decision and you do it in a very, very dignified manner, or we will move against you at the convention and or pursue the 25th Amendment to remove him from office.
How did Joe Biden not know that this was going on behind the scenes?
I think President Biden was very, very insulated, Bruce. All the reports are is that he was only having access to a very select group of staff. In fact, there's been a lot of reporting coming from, very, very central or liberal newspapers such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, basically saying that a lot of the White House staff who had traditional roles that they interacted with the president on a daily basis were being shielded from the president. There was literal shock and surprise on their part, White House staff, when they saw how awful the debate performance was with President Biden. So he had himself surrounded by a very, very small group of people. People, by the way, and we can talk about the humanity of this, the human nature of this, people like his son, his wife, his other family members, his daughter, who were probably trying to protect their father and their husband from this kind of scrutiny, okay? But I think it was just a lack. I mean, I know one of the things which had been very, very true is that a lot of his campaign officials have been accused of not actually showing him bad polling. They were only cherry-picking good polling because they knew that was what President Biden would want to see. Well, you can't effectively run a presidential campaign only showing the candidate things that they want to see. There has to be a moment in time when you're saying, hey, listen, we need to make real strides here, because if we can't hold this blue wall, if Joe Biden, the guy from Scranton and Wilmington, Delaware, can't hold this blue wall in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, we've got enormous problems. And he was just shielded from that information.
And look, you can't ignore the fact that the Harris apparatus had a lot of things in place to get the machinery moving as quickly as it did. They had campaign ads. They have $81 million in funding. They had to know what was going on behind the scenes to get her in the forefront as quickly as they did.
Well, there's an element of, I think, and I don't know what other word to use this, it's either illusion or dishonesty which is taking place. You'll hear in one report that Vice President Harris didn't know he was getting out of the race until, an hour before he actually made the announcement. And then, Bruce...
Well, and let me just say that his campaign staff and some others say they didn't know until a minute before the letter came out that he was going to drop.
Correct. But then 4 hours later on my phone, I'm getting solicitations for Harris for president.
Mm-hmm. I got the same ones.
Yeah. So how does something move that quickly? I mean, obviously, I give the operatives in play there a lot of credit that they could pivot on a dime and move that quickly. But you cannot tell me that there was not a contingency plan already in place, as you've suggested, where they were waiting for this moment to come, and then pop, boom, there we go. And within 24 hours, she's in a full-throated campaign.
And look, they had this as the official Harris for President sign. It was already made. I mean, you can get artwork made up quickly. Don't get me wrong here.
Yeah.
You and I were actually chatting before the show. This is not yet. Francine, I've got the message, so I'm going to go ahead and. Francine's coming here. There's breaking news, and I'll talk about that in just a second from the AP. This is not the first time that the Democrats have done something like this.
Directly. What was it again? What was it?
This is not the first time that the Democrats have done something like this, working behind the scenes to undermine what's going on.
So, listen, I know that this is kind of a Fox News and a Newsmax and a right-wing talking point right now, because the RNC and the Trump campaign are very, very upset that they've spent tens of millions of dollars running against.
And we're going to talk about that.
Running against Joe Biden.
And in fact, Donald Trump saying, "I want my money back."
Right. Yeah.
And that's coming up later on.
Thinking he's somehow entitled to get his money back for this. This is the third from I try to approach this all from a position of principled nonpartisanship. I will gladly call out either political party for what I see as things taking place which don't make sense.
Yes, there's no partisanship.
As an observer, this is the third primary in a row on the Democratic side, going back to 2016, in which there has been chicanery taking place. Okay, in 2016, you'll recall that Donna Brazile and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who were the head of the DNC, had to resign because they were actively working at the DNC with the Clinton campaign, to the extent that Donna Brazile actually gave the Clinton campaign questions before her debate with Bernie Sanders. Okay, 2000 comes along. Bernie Sanders, once again, is winning this process. He's had sweeping wins. We go to South Carolina, the Congressional Black Caucus, James Clyburn, all the Democratic establishment with Obama sweep in. Biden thoroughly and completely beats Sanders in that state. Okay. Barack Obama then gets on the phone, tells every one of these candidates who's running for office to drop out. Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, get out of the race, get behind Joe. We are not going to allow Bernie Sanders to become the nominee of our party, no matter how popular or how well Bernie may have been doing up to that point. He calls Elizabeth Warren and says, you need to stay in the race because we don't want Bernie winning your home state of Massachusetts. All right? Lo and behold, the Super Tuesday comes. Bernie still does well. He wins the state of California with an enormous amount of delegates. But Bernie gets the message. Okay, he's not going to be allowed to be the nominee of the Democratic Party. And by the way, if you don't believe me, where's Bernie Sanders' name being mentioned right now? Bernie knows he's not going to be the nominee of the Democratic Party, no matter what kind of populist appeal there may be. He hasn't even suggested it. He's been behind Joe Biden the entire process because he knows. Now you come to 2024, excuse me. States canceled primaries. All the Democrats nationally were told, this is fine. There's nothing wrong with your candidate. We heard from Karine Jean-Pierre, from literally the White House press secretary. We heard from Democrats, elected, not elected. Oh, behind closed doors, President Biden's sharp. He's great. Then we see that debate to performance. And now we know that the party oligarchs have actually forced him out of the race. So for me, if I'm I guess the thing that's most surprising to me, and I know that the Democrats have to unify quickly around Vice President Harris, I'm just surprised there's not more grassroots anger. That if you were a rank and file Democrat, that this is the third primary cycle in a row where your leadership has been influence peddling who they want to see be your nominee, not the Democratic rank and file.
Oh, you know what? I'm sure there is grassroots anger, but they can't show it publicly because if they don't have that unity in public, then they don't have a snowball's chance against Donald Trump.
That's right. And as I say that, I put those comments out there knowing that in the days to come, the Democrats must unify quickly. This is why you've seen President Biden. I heard this morning, by the way, and I know this was before you prepared the broadcast, the Harris campaign is now reporting that they have enough delegates to secure the nomination at the convention.
Yeah, last official number I heard was 1976, but then I think the number is even higher.
Went up because the statewide parties are getting their delegates to commit. Florida made an announcement, by the way, that all their statewide delegates would be behind Biden. And there again, it's basically to say that the convention is going to be a nothing burger, that this is all going to be wrapped up, that she's going to be the nominee of the party. So even now at this late stage, many progressive in the Democratic side were saying, listen, President Biden's gone. This is an opportunity for a brokered convention. And by the way, whomever comes out of that convention will be stronger, not weaker, because they're going to have the support. And party leadership's not going to let that happen, Bruce. And we see it. They're all coalescing around President Harris.
And they
Vice President Harris.
Look, they wanted a virtual convention anyway, even when Biden was going to be running.
For a totally different reason then, because they didn't want to expose President Biden.
And you and I were texting 9:30, 10 o'clock last night, and we were talking about these conspiracies, what was going on behind closed walls, and I'm thinking way back. I was thinking Julius Caesar, et tu Brute, but I couldn't figure out how to go ahead and text et tu Brute, meaning being stabbed in the back.
Yeah. You can't select Latin on your phone.
No, you can't. Or you can find a translator.
Spanish. That's the same thing.
There is breaking news that I want to pass on here. The Secret Service director has resigned, Kimberly Cheatle. As you know, she was questioned before Congress yesterday, and I think it was Kimberly Mace who was one of the representatives, Karen Mace, who basically, when the Secret Service director was being questioned and questioned hard by members of Congress, and she was saying, well, look, we're looking into this, and how did you not know that the shooter was on the roof? How did you let the 20-year-old get through? They had a scope in their backpack. They got past the security, then they got around the security. There were snipers that were up there, and the answer was, we're investigating, we're doing this, and basically that one representative said, you're foolish. The S word. The Secret Service director has resigned. She was standing her ground up until yesterday, until she got a verbal beating by Congress. There is no excuse for what fell through the cracks in the assassination attempt against former President Trump in Butler County, Pennsylvania. You were 20 minutes away when that happened. Lax security. There are a lot of questions that remain unanswered. So, the investigation is ongoing. 2 investigations, Department of Homeland Security, Secret Service, and the Biden administration also conducting their own. So that's the latest news, and you heard it here first on.
Let me add to that too. I think one of the things which really was a good indicator that this was going to happen in the coming days is when you've got Nancy Mace, as you've suggested, very much a Republican conservative firebrand out of South Carolina, I think is where she's from. And then you've got Ro Khanna, who from California, who's one of the most progressive members of the House.
Right.
A rock rib Democrat, okay? Both going after the director of the Secret Service.
And on the same page.
Absolutely on the same page. It was one of those moments where, very rare in our politics today, where Democrats and Republicans were able to come together.
Good job, Caleb. There's the Secret Service director.
Right. They were both able to come together, and you see, oh, by the way, a rumored vice presidential, perhaps right there, Jamie Raskin. But you see them come together and basically say this is unacceptable behavior. And you want to know the real motivation here, Bruce, and why the American public should be concerned? Because the Secret Service is charged with protecting you whether you're a Democrat or a Republican.
Right.
This is a bipartisan.
There is no politics.
No, and they're also charged with protecting the adult children of the President of the United States. So how, if we're thinking about how the shooter apparently was so easily able to get at Donald Trump, how easily would it be to potentially get at the future daughter or son of a sitting president or the spouse of a sitting president? I mean, these are the concerns, and this is why the Secret Service has such a important role to fulfill.
And this man was seen going roof to roof. He'd been spotted.
He was flying a drone over the fairgrounds, and the Secret Service themselves admit, well, we never flew a drone.
Right.
And he was somehow able to fly a drone.
There are too many questions.
Yeah.
Too many questions.
Too many questions.
Well, we were short-staffed, we were this, we were that. Too many unacceptable answers.
And the one thing I think for the Republic and for us is that we need to hope moving forward this remains a bipartisan investigation, that this doesn't somehow get railed and go down the track, as it always seems to do in our politics, of the Republicans and the Democrats making this an issue. This is a core function of the Secret Service to keep our elected officials safe. So let's keep it that way, and let's do this as objectively as we can, and let's find the truth. No matter where the truth leads us.
And I can tell you that since they have stepped up the amount of protection for all of the candidates,
I think they've even offered protection now to RFK Jr.
Yes, they have.
Yeah, they've even extended
which
it to
they
him.
denied to him.
They did
for quite some time,
right.
Which is reprehensible because you know what happened to his father.
Yeah.
All right, back to the other issue at hand that we've been discussing. The other big question: who is the next Democratic nominee? You would think it's a fait accompli. Biden's endorsement of Kamala Harris would give her a leg up. And Daniel, 2 days ago, it didn't seem a slam dunk, but now she has been backed by, more than 2,000 pledged delegates needed to win on the first ballot. Does that mean that Harris has what she needs before August 19th? She's going to get that virtual nomination. We'll talk about some potential bugs, but is this a fait accompli?
Yeah, I think so. I think that this is all done except the convention itself. I think that as this continues to snowball and as she demonstrates her viability, I think as she continues to make public appearances, that the party is going to coalesce around her. And let me also say, you want to know one of the biggest reasons why? Is because no Democrat who's wants and has designs to run in 2028 wants to take on Kamala Harris right now. That's just a fact. There are a whole slew of candidates out there who are really biding their time for 4 years, Bruce. Whether that be Gavin Newsom, whether that be Gretchen Whitmire, whether that be Governor Shapiro from Pennsylvania, probably the favorite right now we've talked about being her vice presidential candidate, her vice presidential running mate, right? None of these people want to get on the wrong side of Harris now because they all want to have a positive shot of leading the party in 2028, assuming that she doesn't become President Harris this election cycle, okay? Rumors that I've heard and I think are really, really interesting. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. By the time 2028 runs around, she'll be able to run for president. Please note how quickly her and Bernie Sanders and members of the squad got behind Kamala Harris almost immediately. I would argue, Bruce, that's strategy on their part, charting out their own political careers in the future. The one thing that we've learned about the Democratic Party, too, is if you drift outside of the Democratic Party in any way, either in performance or in rhetoric, you will be closed off very, very quickly. And there's a lot of people who have met that, from RFK Jr., who started this whole process running as a Democrat, who wanted to be in the primary ballots, and they shunned, to individuals who, it's hard to remember this, but in 2016, I believe she was the vice chairman of the DNC, was Tulsi Gabbard, the congresswoman from Hawaii. Well, she hasn't been Democratic adjacent now in several years, okay? So I think that they're making that calculation. They want to be in good. I personally think AOC has designs on someday becoming the next Nancy Pelosi. I think you see that in terms of the way she's presenting herself and how she's carrying herself now. But I think that's the big answer to the question. Are there Democrats out there who could challenge Harris? Absolutely. But it's not really in their political interest to do so.
Right. Now, the one exception to the rule that you just mentioned might be Joe Manchin. He's been an independent, says he wants to come back into the Democratic fold, says he won't run against Harris for this nomination, won't be a candidate for president, but he wants a mini primary competitive process to choose the nominee. He thinks she's too far left. And this was a surprise. Barack Obama came out just yesterday and said, think we should have a mini primary as well. Any chance of that happening? Because that doesn't present the unified front that the Democrats need in order to take on Donald Trump effectively.
Well, this becomes the question, and I would submit to you, if you're a Democrat out there right now and you were asking yourself the question, is it better to have a competitive or a mini primary process or a brokered convention and let the cream of the crop rise to the top, than following that convention as a party, unified, get behind whomever that person is? Or do you do what apparently is taking place right now? You anoint Kamala Harris as the nominee without getting any kind of feedback from Democratic voters or the delegates, and then you move forward. I can tell you again, this is completely anecdotally, just looking at my social media feed, a lot of Duval Dems, a lot of people statewide Dems, there's no question, they are already behind Kamala Harris. I mean, they would be behind whoever the nominee was, because being a partisan, that's just the nature of, I mean, if you're, involved with the GOP here in Duval County or the Dems here in Duval County, your thoughts are basically scripted for you. You don't deviate from that script. You know what it's going to be. And I think that's what's happening with Harris.
So go ahead and hold it. You'll satisfy some questions, but we know what the outcome's going to be.
Yeah. And by the way, we'll be picking on the Democrats too, but this is very much on the Republican playbook too. But the one thing I would say about the Republicans, even with the popularity of Trump, they had a very, very competitive and nasty primary process in 2016. People ran, including Governor DeSantis and Nikki Haley, ran against President Trump in 2020. There was never a suggestion that the Republicans canceled their primary process, as we've just had with Biden. So again, and I think when you look at the GOP, I mean, think about how quickly they come back to the fold. I mean, President Trump just chose somebody to be his vice president who used to call him America's Hitler, and now he's his vice president. So the way that they can come together is essential for the GOP, and I think that's why you're seeing this happy with Harris. If you're somebody who is a member of the Democratic Party, the strategy of just unifying, getting behind it, I've heard some people say, well, we don't even like Kamala Harris, but Donald Trump is once again this existential threat to democracy. I'll just pinch my nose, we'll get in, and we'll be all on board with Kamala Harris. I've seen a lot of this. You've probably seen this too, the resurrection of the "I'm with her" slogan that they used for Hillary Clinton in 2016. I don't know how wise it is to repeat a failed slogan and do that again, but at any rate,
not very wise at all.
No, I don't think so either. I mean, I think the better tack that I've seen her taking is, I think, as you suggested, is basically prosecutor versus felon. Okay, the problem that Harris is going to have there on her political left, which a lot of people don't pay attention to, it's a small percentage of the population. Kamala Harris was a very, very aggressive prosecutor in California. I mean, she had a record of really being that state's top cop that aggravated a lot of people who were in minority communities in California, a lot of people who represented the poor. She had backlash at the time by organizations like the
talking about the article in the New York Times.
Yeah. And organizations like the ACLU, who back at that time were condemning her because she was such a tough prosecutor. Well, that's left a bad taste in a lot of progressives' mouths. The other thing, and this, she's got the benefit of 5 years ago too. When you look back at her failed campaign that she had in 2020, she was kind of all over the board in a lot of different policy positions. One day she was for Medicare for all, and she was raising her hand that she wanted to eliminate private insurance. The next day she was saying, when she got pushback, oh, I didn't understand that question. So will she be able to mature as a candidate 5 years into this, 5 years into the vice presidency? Personally, I think she will. I think that she is a gifted orator. I think that she was, while you may not like what she did while she was Attorney General in California, she was effective in her office, okay? Very, very hard to get a read on her as a senator, because she was really only a senator for a very short period of time, Bruce. Some would argue, guess who else was a senator for a very short period of time? One Barack Obama. Very short period of time in the state of Illinois. So, at any rate, that's how I would see the situation right now.
So, ironically, the last open convention was in Chicago in 1968. It was not pretty.
No.
Not pretty at all.
No.
The nation was it in a different place? You can't compare apples to oranges, but it was a very volatile time. Yeah. There are some in America who are quite vocal about Kamala Harris's electability because there are racist and sexist factions in society. Legitimate concerns for the Democratic Party?
Sadly, yes. There are, I think all of us, anyone who's listening or viewing this program would admit to knowing people in their life who just simply will not vote for a woman, or who simply will not vote for someone of color.
Though they may not admit it.
They may not admit it, or they may just admit it. I mean, there's an entire generation of people, my mom's age and older, who just have a very traditional view of politics, and they hold the view that politics is why they support women voting. They just don't think that it's a woman's place to be involved in politics. It kind of comes from like that Mad Men culture, if you've ever watched Mad Men. women. The male dominated the business circles, men dominated the political circles, and there are people out there who just, I refer to it openly as misogyny. When you're literally looking at a female candidate and saying, I'm not going to vote for somebody because they're a woman, you're a misogynist. But sadly, there are people out there that's the case. One of the things that I think we'll talk about this a little bit moving forward too is Kamala Harris's husband is Jewish. One of the leading candidates for white. One of her leading candidates for vice president is also Jewish. Are there Americans who would not vote for that ticket simply because there's a Jew on the ticket? Sadly, Bruce, the answer is yes. Okay. The flip side of that is there's also going to be a lot of enthusiasm to vote for our first female president, which will also help counterride that. But as we know, just being a woman at the top of the ticket, Hillary Clinton, is not a guarantee that you're going to get women to vote for you anyway.
True. You posed this question, and I found it interesting. If VPs are chosen to help the candidate win, does that mean that Kamala Harris is actually the best candidate for the Democratic Party now that Biden's out of the race?
Well, very, very good question. One, that we know that Harris is positioned to keep all of his money. Okay, so you're not going to have to worry about taking the Biden campaign coffers, putting them into a super PAC.
And they've filed with the FEC.
That's correct. They're filed with the FEC. They have all that, so they're going to be able to keep that, and they're going to be able to keep the campaign's infrastructure. I think, I don't know what kind of message it would send, Bruce, to literally, tell the President of the United States he's no longer allowed to run, which is essentially what Nancy Pelosi did, and then tell his vice president, who's next in line on the party, that she's not going to be the person. I think that's a concern. What would it do for individuals out there, for African Americans who are looking at this and saying, wait a minute, we have a African American vice president and now the party's not going to let her run because they're going to push her out of the way for somebody else? I don't think you can do that. We've already discussed in this program previously, African American men right now, 25% of them are leaning towards Donald Trump. What happens if you get the sitting vice president of the United States who's black out of the way for a different candidate? I don't see how you can do that.
Well, the Black Caucus would run, the Black vote would run from the Democratic Party,
or more likely,
lose all their support.
Or you know what? Or they would lose the race to the number one person that campaigns lose the race to. It's called the couch. People who just don't go out to vote. The couch wins a lot of elections. And
that's the other thing that I think is important here. If there were people who were apathetic and weren't going to vote, I think that the turnout is going to be much greater than it would have been.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think again, what the Democrats are going to have to do, they're going to have to do this skillfully. Is for a lot of people, they are aware of who Vice President Harris is because she was on obviously the Vice President. They don't know anything about her. This is going to be a complete reintroduction of Kamala Harris to the rest of the United States, and how that's done. Like, you and I may have a long memory of her first campaign, Bruce, but most people do not. She was out of the race so quickly. She didn't make it to Iowa.
Well, so, I have such a good memory that I know that some of the things that she said, I think it was yesterday or the day before, were word for word, verbatim, from her first presidential campaign.
Well, yeah, because she thought at the time it worked for her.
Yeah.
And by the way, her line of attack, if you'll remember back in 2019, one of the things which made her jump off the charts was her ability to attack Donald Trump. All right. It's really when she got on the debate stage with other Democrats that she got exposed. But the one thing that I would say that I think is going to be in her favor as she moves forward with this, there is no Bernie Sanders anymore. The Democratic Party, they're no longer back in the 16 and 20 cycle when they have to talk about things like Medicare for all, increasing the federal minimum wage, and a lot of these core anti-poverty issues.
Right.
They're able now economically to come back to the center.
The issues are different.
Right. The issues are different. So you're not going to have to see her try to defend and appease progressives with Medicare for all. You're going to hear, I think, just a lot of the standard, do you want President another 4 years of President Trump? We have to stop this existential threat to our democracy. He's a loose cannon. Look what he's going to do with Project 2025, which has been dominating a lot of the headlines.
Which, of course, he knows nothing about, even though some of his core people are involved in it.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
What can I say?
You can't deny that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about her strategy, because the reports indicate that her strategy to run has actually been in the development stage for some time, maybe since right after the Biden-Trump debate, maybe before. If you look at her newly developed campaign tweet, it pretty well sums things up. I prosecuted sex predators. Trump is one. I shut down for-profit scam colleges. He ran one. I held big banks accountable. He's owned by them. I'm not just prepared to take on Trump. I'm prepared to beat him. It's shaping up to be used, one political analyst term, term as a prosecutor versus felons, as you mentioned before. This is going to get nasty.
Yeah, it could. But I think it's, if I were advising Vice President Harris, I think it's a great line of attack. I think if you can keep the focus on that, it's going to motivate your base. Obviously, there's independent voters and there's Republican voters out there that Trump's criminality is not a factor. Okay, this ad isn't targeted at any of those individuals. It's targeted at getting at her base. I think that if I were advising her to keep that up, as well as start discussing what kind of things, one of the things that Biden has gotten a lot of credit for, Bruce, in his one term, is a lot of the programs that he fought for economically benefited a lot of Americans. Okay, he did a lot of things. His work with the National Labor Relations Board and injecting life back into unions. I'll tell you this: unions in California like Kamala Harris very, very much. They have always been on her side because they've always seen her as being pro-labor. So I think if she can come out, I think if she can make some solid issues. Let me remind you of this. Back even when Donald Trump was winning Florida, okay, Floridians passed a $15 minimum wage statewide. It's a popular issue with Republicans and Democrats alike. If she could lean into some of that populism and say, this is how we're going to make it happen, I think a lot of progressive voters, people who are skeptical of her, even to say things, I'm looking at a second Bill of Rights. It may not be exactly like FDR had, but I'm looking at really, and I mean this, we're going to cut the cost of rents, and we're going to go after private equity firms who are buying all of our housing properties in the United States. These are things which are popular. Okay,
picking up on what Biden was starting to do.
Correct, trying to, and then hopefully, she'll be able to have a Congress that she can work with, or it will all be fleeting and won't matter anyway.
Well, and that's interesting you bring that up, because I think a lot of what has developed and happened is that even if Harris doesn't win, that the Democrats are trying to look at the down ballot because they want to take back the House.
For sure, they'd like to take back the House. I think that they're desperate to hold on to the Senate.
They're not going to do that.
Yeah, it's going to be very, very difficult. But the one thing that I would say before Biden is, even when we discussed this, there were down ballot Democrats at the Senate who were outperforming Biden by 10 or 12 points in real critical states. Like, you can't lose Sherrod Brown in Ohio. You got to be able to keep that. You can't lose a Bobby Casey in Pennsylvania. You got to be able to keep that. And both of them still have their head above water. I think that getting Biden off the ticket and getting Harris on the ticket will probably only help them even feel better. Okay, but for example, are they going to be able to keep the Senate seat in Arizona? We'll just have to see. We'll have to see with the polling, and that's going to be the other thing people are going to be watching is in the next couple of weeks as she's introduced. Where do the polls go and where they move? Right. I know it sounds redundant, but if they can't get to a position, in my mind, after their convention, if they can't get to a position where they're in command in those critical states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and those are still considered battleground states, and they're still scratching there, they're in trouble.
They are in trouble. But the reality is that Arizona plays much differently now than it would have 2 months ago.
It does. It does.
We got to take a breath. When Path to the Polls continues, the MAGA world is ticked and screaming fraud. We talked about it. They want their money back. Why? Because they were forced to waste money. What? More Path to the Polls after the break. Welcome back to Path to the Polls. Daniel Cronrath, our political analyst. I'm Bruce Hamilton. Appreciate you spending some time with us. It's been a wild discussion, so it may get more wild here because apparently the MAGA world is really mad that Donald Trump is no longer running against Joe Biden. Trump and his supporters are slamming Joe Biden for quitting the race, bemoaning the millions spent running against Biden and the fact that Trump is now the oldest presidential candidate in the race. In fact, Trump wrote on Truth Social, "Now we have to start all over again, and we should be reimbursed for fraud." Daniel, can't make this stuff up. It's almost laughable.
It is. I mean, it's serious, but it's also kind of amusing. You know, nobody told Donald Trump or the RNC that they had to spend any money against Joe Biden. Nobody told them that they had to spend this money prior to a Democratic National Convention. They certainly could have held on to their powder for a little bit longer. I mean, obviously, he's the assumed nominee, but at the same time, you know, at least up to 3 weeks ago, they saw the same debate with Biden on stage that we did, okay? There were times that Donald Trump, you could even tell, was biting his tongue, Bruce, because Biden's performance was so awful it spoke for itself.
It surprised me that he bit his tongue.
Well, he didn't need to say anything. I think one time he said, "I have no idea what he said." I mean, I didn't either, but the point of it is that, you know, Trump could have used that as a launching point. So listen, I mean, is there anything legally they're going to be able to do here? Is there any? No, of course not. I mean, there's nothing like that. I think
no fraud.
No, and I think what they really need to do, and they're going to do this in the coming days, is they're going to pivot off of Biden. You know, as popular as Donald Trump is with his base, the one thing you don't want to be looked at viewing now is beating up this guy who's on his way out of office. What are you going to gain by that?
But Trump did. I mean, his first comment, you know, after Biden hung it up was, "Worst president in U.S. history." You thought he would have had a little bit of class.
Well, you think he would actually know who James Buchanan was, perhaps, or Andrew Johnson, or have any kind of like knowledge of history. We're really getting into some of the worst presidents that we've had. But you know, it is what it is. I mean, that's the way Trump. It's effective with MAGA world. It's effective for Donald Trump. He's a showman. He feels like it works for him. By the way, I mean, he's 1 for 2 in presidential elections, so it did work for him at one period of time. But I think, you know, again, moving off the criticisms of Biden will come in time. It is really amazing to me. One of the other interesting things too is this. Despite the fact that they're rallying around Harris and that the party oligarchs made Biden get out of the race, the praise that the Democrats are heaping on him is, I mean, they're making him sound like Lyndon Johnson from the 1960s in terms of his domestic policy. You know, like I've heard people like our age and older, Bruce, like saying things like this. He's been the best domestic policy president of my lifetime.
Does that go back to what he did in the Senate, though, years ago?
I mean, listen, if you really wanted me to critique his Senate record, we could do an entire show on that.
You know, I'm thinking about...
I know you have an affinity for Joe Biden. I've always seen him very much as a center-right.
I wouldn't go that far. You know, I've seen Joe Biden do things on a personal level. Legislatively, I have a lot of questions about things that he did. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I think, but I mean, listen, from putting on the Democratic lens now, if you're looking what he did with the CHIPS Act, if you're looking what he did with the infrastructure bill, if you're looking at a lot of the investments that he's put into clean energy, okay, these are all things that are right in the wheelhouse of the Democratic Party. Do you realize for a period of time after COVID with the child tax credit, we eliminated child poverty in this country because of his leadership in the Democrats in Congress by half, and then sadly we let it lapse without even like a word or a whisper. Again, the things that Biden has done, he's probably been the best president for labor, honestly, since Jimmy Carter, because even Clinton and Obama never really supported labor, even though they claimed to support labor. Joe Biden did. He's the first president who ever went to a picket line with the UAW striking workers, okay? Again, but everything's paradoxical when you talk about presidents of the United States. He's also the guy who shut down the National Railroad strike and said, get back to work, without them getting one additional day of leave a year, okay? So, but I mean, I think you could definitely make a strong case there for bringing us out of COVID. A lot of people liked the stability they provided post-Donald Trump, okay? But the other thing which is really going to take place that is going to be interesting with Harris, Bruce, which we haven't talked about, but we can, is what's going on in the Ukraine and especially what's going on in Gaza, okay? There are many people on the left that despite the fact that they're willing to praise Donald Trump, President Biden, excuse me, domestically, his open support and his unflinching support for Benjamin Netanyahu is something which is very, very unpopular on the left. And I tell you what, as this week goes on, we know Netanyahu is going to be coming to address Congress. It'll be very, very interesting to see how many protesters are out in the mall in Washington, D.C. and what that group looks like.
And Kamala Harris is already taking heat because she is not going to be there when Netanyahu makes that address. And let me make it very clear, I have no particular affinity for any politician. I have an affinity for certain issues that they back.
Right.
That's it, plain and simple. Right. You know, if you looked at my voting record, it would be based on certain issues and not a particular politician.
Gotcha.
Regardless of what you say.
Well, no, understand. I mean, the reason I use really.
I even backed Donald Trump. See, I even backed Donald Trump on some of the things that he did when he was in office. So.
Well, the reason I say that is, you know, we've talked stories. I know that you've met Joe Biden and you've been with him on the train and things like that in Delaware, and he's a very, very approachable guy, and he, by all definitions, so that's what I meant to say in affinity. I'm not saying that you worship at the shrine.
No,
of Joe Biden.
I don't trust any politician as far as I could throw them. Donald Trump.
That's a good quality for a journalist, by the way, Bruce.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an old-fashioned quality. When you remember the day when journalists and politicians were adversarial.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, if you were walking down the street in the 50s and you saw a newspaper man coming up to you, you'd run like hell.
Oh, absolutely.
Today, we just swap jobs back and forth, and we go to MSNBC, then we go away.
I take my responsibility very, very, very seriously, though, you know, judging by some of the email I get, some of you don't believe that, but I will tell you that I do, and I understand what that responsibility is. Donald Trump is now the oldest presidential candidate in the race. Will his age, his health, and his mental acuity become an issue?
Well, I mean, it's kind of rich that the Democrats are going to try to make that an issue after they've been hiding Joe Biden, obviously, for the last year and a half or more. It could, particularly now that if he decides to debate Harris, which I've heard that he is not inclined to do. I would not do if I were Donald Trump. There's no way I'd go in a one-on-one debate with a former prosecutor if I'm Donald Trump.
Because she'll fact check him live on the air and not wait for the media outlets to do it.
And she's got that skill set that, frankly, Joe Biden would not have in being able to do that. She's going to be able to memorize dozens and dozens and dozens of receipts and on-the-fly respond, because that's what she's been trained to do as an effective prosecutor her entire career. Okay, so I don't think that you're going to be seeing that kind of a debate happen. Interestingly enough, if the top of the ticket doesn't debate Bruce, what do you think about the possibility of J.D. Vance and whoever Kamala Harris's running mate debating is?
I think that's more likely.
Would we have a vice presidential debate? Because that could be a very, very interesting look into the future of both of those political parties, depending upon who her running mate is.
All right, let's talk about the field of running mates. A field of 6 has been bandied about as vice presidential choices for Ms. Harris in no particular order. Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Each has their strengths and weaknesses, but in the end, the campaign has to decide who would give Harris an edge over Donald Trump, who in this field gives her that advantage. I'm hearing it may very well be Josh Shapiro, but who knows if the grapevine's right.
Yeah, I mean, again, just to repeat this, our opinion on $1.75 will get you a fare on the JTA. If I were going to handicap this, and if I were giving advice to her team, my two choices would be either Shapiro or Senator Kelly. Mm-hmm. Okay,
and that goes back to what we just mentioned in passing here, that Arizona is probably more important now than it was 3-4 months ago.
I mean, if you think about this, they both perform the first core function, is that Arizona and Pennsylvania would definitely be more in play for Vice President Harris in the case that they were both on the ticket. Why? Shapiro polls very, very well in Pennsylvania. I think he's near 60%. Okay, he annihilated his gubernatorial candidate. Okay,
he's good off the cuff.
Good off the cuff, young, sharp, really, really good guy. Okay, then you got Kelly. All right, astronaut, former husband, husband of Gabby Giffords, of course, the member of Congress who was shot.
Bipartisan appeal.
Bipartisan appeal, very important state. I mean, again, I think strategically, if you pick Shapiro, you're trying to secure Pennsylvania. It's a defensive move. If you pick Kelly, you're going on the offensive and you're keeping a state which is not. Now, Biden got it in 2000, okay, or 2020, excuse me, but you're going on the offensive. So I think that's part of the calculation going on. I've heard a lot of Democrats suggest Pete Buttigieg. I don't see that helping the Democrats win this nomination. I've heard Andy Beshear is very, very popular in Kentucky, a red state, and Beshear is a Democratic governor.
Some of interest in young voters neutralized Trump's choice to put a 39-year-old on the Republican ticket, but his downfall is he might appeal to voters on the national stage. He doesn't hail from a must-win state. I think that's the biggest downfall.
Yeah, Bashir doesn't put Kentucky in play.
Right.
That's flat out. He just doesn't put Kentucky in play, despite the fact that he's a good young guy. You know, Pritzker from Illinois is somebody who, you know, he's been described as like a billionaire populist. He's got all this cash, but he can just go to like the local farm show and just, you know, glad hand and, you know, eat deep fried butter and all those things. And he has kind of this like folksy appeal to him. But again, interestingly enough, he's only like at 48% in his own state of Illinois. So, and I don't think at the end of the day, when you get this, I don't think that they need to be picking somebody just because of their ability to provide money to the campaign or raise money. I mean, that was what part of the Republican calculation with Doug Burgum for a while being his candidate because he's independently wealthy. At the end of the day, Bruce, these candidates are not going to have an issue raising money. The money is going to start pouring in. We're going to be looking over billion-dollar races for both of these candidates. And honestly, when you just get down to a binary choice between Harris or Trump, at the end of the day, it's kind of interesting to me. You don't need necessarily billions of dollars to frame that race. You know, for me, I think the money would be better spent down ballot. I mean, if you're really the Democrats and you want to win the House, or if you're the Democrats and you want to win the Senate, you know, that's where I would be focusing, because honestly, at the end of the day, Harris and super PACs can take care of Harris pretty well in my mind.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. By the way, did you know that Donald Trump donated $6,000 to Kamala Harris's campaign in 2020?
I did not.
Yeah, he did.
Okay.
Thinking out loud here and knowing hindsight is 2020, would President Biden have served himself better to agree to one term, fulfilled his dream to be the nation's commander-in-chief, and groom a successor? I mean, having covered him before when I worked, I know his legacy was important to him.
Yeah, you know, that's really interesting to say, Bruce. I mean, again, I'm kind of repeating myself earlier. For folks out there who are Democrats, I wish that this had been recognized a year ago and that Democrats in the United States would have had the opportunity to actually go to the polls and have a competitive primary. I wish we could have accelerated what we're going to be seeing in 2028 to 2024 and to found a new leader and to really vetted our candidates and to give Democrats an opportunity to choose who they really wanted to be to their nominee. You're right about his legacy. I think the other thing, which is very, very important to note, nobody wants to be a one-term president. I am very sure that when you're talking about the Biden presidential library that they'll someday build in Delaware, nobody wants to be remembered as George H.W. Bush. Nobody wants to be remembered as Lyndon Johnson. You know, the idea of not being able to pursue that second term, the idea of not being able to create a legacy of being a two-term president is probably very difficult for President Biden. It's probably difficult for Jill and Hunter and its children, too.
Yeah, but I remember he said something in 2020. He said something like, I'm just a bridge here. And the suggestion was that maybe he was thinking about just being a one-term president.
So here's the other thing. If you really get into a lot of left-leaning media, a lot of people who are on the left of the Democratic Party, when I say a lot, I mean, you're talking 10, 15%, you know, this is very much, they're angry about this because they wanted that primary process that I'm speaking of. And they saw Biden failing before their eyes, and they remember the promises he made about being this bridge and being this bridge to the future. You know, and by the way, at the end of the day, you know, if he had kept this one-term promise, Vice President Harris would have still been a viable candidate. I mean, the Democrats would have had the opportunity to choose her. Now they're just being force-fed the vice president. And by the way, again, in order to stop the threat, which is Donald Trump, it is probably definitely in their best interest to do so at this point.
Yeah. I think we do have more of a horse race now than we would have before. As much as I'd like to go on, we do have to put a cap on this. Historian and filmmaker Ken Burns tweeted, "History recognizes actions that are bigger than self." He says Joe Biden will go down as one of the great ones, quietly doing good things for all Americans that put him up there in terms of legislative action with LBJ and FDR. You kind of addressed this. You think he'll go down as one of the great ones? Did this move protect his legacy? Is Burns on track?
I mean, listen, now you're just getting into personal opinion and you're not really getting into, I don't think that with what's going on in the Middle East right now and 186,000 Gazans dead, that the lens of history will be kind to Joe Biden relative to his foreign policy. I think he very well could end up carving out a legacy for himself such as Lyndon Johnson had. When you look at what LBJ did, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the creation of the Early Secondary Education Act, the Higher Education Act, clean water, clean air, the preservation of natural lands. Johnson's domestic legacy, Bruce, was incredible, okay? His Vietnam War legacy, disastrous, which is why he didn't run for office again. And I think that when we get a little bit further removed from this and we begin to really look at the death toll of what's going on in Gaza, And I think, depending upon what we see going on in Ukraine, which, again, in my opinion, Ukraine cannot win this war. We're fighting somebody who we believe to be a dictator in Vladimir Putin. But how many dead Ukrainians are going to be, eventually at the end of the day, are we going to be counting based upon our desire to create have Ukraine join NATO for some reason, okay? And I think that we're going to look back, and even if my words are unpopular right now or people don't agree with them, I feel pretty confident that as we move forward historically, we're going to be looking back at this time and being like, wow. The other thing I'd say to you, just as kind of my final remark, I heard a quote the other day which is really, really interesting. It says, liberals hate all war except for the ones they're currently fighting. And in my mind, that's really, really accurate, because I think back, I look now at the Iraq war in 2000, and most Democrats, in the 2000s, and most Democrats would say, what a terrible war, there was no weapons of mass destruction, look at the destruction we caused. But man, at the time, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden were voting right in line to go into Iraq. And I feel like the same way today, that we're going to look back in 10 years and we're going to be saying to ourselves, and Democrats are going to be saying to themselves, what were we doing in these battlefields? And even at the time that we thought that this was a good thing that we were supporting.
You know, if I remember what my history professors taught me, the difference between LBJ and Joe Biden, didn't LBJ have time to at least paint his own portrait in the public's mind by addressing them and addressing what was going on, and leave some final thoughts?
He did.
Joe Biden, I don't know that he's going to have a chance to do that.
He might, I think the other thing which is a big difference, which I am actually going to give President Biden more credit for this, LBJ ran on the legacy of JFK. Mm-hmm. He felt he had a mandate because a young popular president had been assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Okay, and a lot of the agenda that LBJ adopted was straight the agenda of JFK. It was not original LBJ agenda. Okay, in fact, what he did with the civil rights, if you study or you've read any books on Lyndon Baines Johnson, he was openly racist. I mean, he was a segregationist. I mean, throughout almost his entire career. Yet at the same time, when we talk about the paradox of being a president, this man passed historic civil rights legislation. I mean, he was legitimately, for African Americans and minorities in this country, was the most influential president since Lincoln. All right?
But there was somebody else's foundation upon which
there was somebody else's foundation. That's correct. I mean, and think about the things that he even strove to, like when President Kennedy said, by the end of this decade, we will put a man on the moon. Johnson could have dropped that. I mean, he could have just basically said, we can't afford to do this right now. We could have. No, it was something that the foundation was laid, and he pursued it, and we fulfilled Kennedy's vision, for space. So I think Biden deserves a lot of credit. Now, the other thing you could say is that the JFK assassination was a historical moment. Guess what else was? COVID-19. Okay, that was a launching point and an opportunity for Joe Biden to pass historic legislation because the coffers were open. We were spending trillions of dollars coming out of COVID, and to his credit, he seized the moment and he looked at things that we needed to do in this country, like beginning to do our own microchips. I mean, I think that was probably for me one of the most significant things, is understanding that for our national security, there are certain jobs and certain things that we need to be building and making in the United States that we don't want to be having made in China, in India, and other countries around the world. And I think COVID really put that into specific relief, Bruce, when you looked at the things that we could not get. We couldn't complete the construction of new cars because we didn't make chips here. Okay, they were all sitting over in China. They were sitting on, and of course the shipping industry completely collapsed. We were unable to get those here. So again, I think that's going to be the better part of Biden's legacy, is his domestic accomplishments in those areas.
Guess what else?
What's that?
Americans have short memories.
Yes, we do.
Appreciate you watching Path to the Polls. Always love to hear from you. Keep it on the even, Stephen. Path to the Polls encore presentation tonight at 7. Watch it on demand, news4jax.com and the News4Jax YouTube channel. Appreciate you.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.